Imagine it's December 1945. You are Sir John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of his generation, sitting alone at a wooden table in a freezing negotiation room in Washington, D.C. In front of you lies a single document. On that document is one number, 1.1 pounds billion. That is the amount Britain must immediately borrow from the United States just to survive the next few years after winning the war. But here is the brutal twist no one dares say out loud. Britain has just won the greatest war in human history. Yet it is now forced to beg for money from its own ally on terms so harsh that they will quietly end the British Empire forever. The man who helped design the entire post-war financial system is staring at the reality that victory on the battlefield has become financial surrender at the negotiating table. Most history books will never tell you this part. They will show you the victory parades. They will never show you this room. If you stay with me until the end of this video, you will understand the secret economic mechanism that destroyed the British Empire not with bombs, but with debt, and why almost nobody talks about it even today. Most history books will never tell you this part. They will show you Churchill raising two fingers in victory. They will show you crowds cheering in Trafalgar Square. They will never show you this freezing room in Washington, where the real war, the war of ledgers and repayment terms, was quietly being lost. Because what happened in 1945 was not just the end of one war. It was the beginning of the greatest transfer of economic power in modern history. A transfer that did not happen on a battlefield, but across a wooden table with a single sheet of paper. Britain had spent everything to defeat Nazi Germany. It had liquidated its foreign investments, burned through its gold reserves, and borrowed at a scale never seen before in its long history. By the time the guns fell silent, the British Empire, the largest empire the world had ever known, was effectively bankrupt. The brutal truth is this. Victory costs more than defeat. The loans that kept Britain fighting when it stood alone in 1940 and 1941 now came with conditions so severe that they would dismantle the very empire those loans were meant to protect. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 was not aid. It was the price of survival. And the price included the forced opening of British markets, the end of imperial trade preferences, and the rapid decline of sterling as the world's dominant currency. This was not a failure of courage. This was not a failure of military strategy. This was a failure of economic design, a design that looked perfectly rational during the heat of war, but became catastrophic the moment peace arrived. And here is the insight almost no one talks about, even today. The same mechanism that destroyed the British Empire in 1945 is still operating right now, only in different forms and under different names. The only difference is that back then, the world watched an empire fall in real time. Today, most people still believe their own systems are immune. In the next 25 minutes, we are not going to celebrate victory. We are going to perform the autopsy. We will examine exactly how a nation that controlled a quarter of the planet's land surface and a quarter of its population could go from global superpower to financial dependent in less than 2 years. We will look at the hidden maturity wall of war debt, the refinancing trap, the 4 brutal options any indebted power eventually faces, and why Britain could only choose the least bad one, the one that quietly ended its empire. And most importantly, we will extract the cold, timeless lessons about debt, power, and perception that apply directly to anyone who believes their own savings, their own country, or their own system is somehow different. Because if you truly understand what happened to Britain in 1945, you will never look at national debt, war financing, or victory the same way again. Let's begin with the mechanism that made this collapse not only possible, but mathematically inevitable. By the end of 1945, Britain did not face one debt problem. It faced 3 problems colliding at the exact same moment. The first was the sheer scale of accumulated war debt. Britain had borrowed massively from its own citizens through war bonds, from the Commonwealth, and most critically from the United States. The total public debt had swollen to roughly 250% of GDP, a level that would be considered catastrophic by any modern standard. But size alone was not the killer. The second and far more dangerous problem was the structure of that debt. Much of it had been raised on short-term or emergency terms during the desperate years of 1940 and 1941, when Britain stood alone against Germany. These credits were never meant to be permanent. They were bridge financing, and now the bridge was collapsing. Every single one of those short-term obligations had to be refinanced or repaid in the immediate post-war years. Britain was forced to roll over enormous amounts of debt at precisely the moment when its economy was exhausted, its export earnings had collapsed, and its ability to generate foreign currency was crippled. This is what economists call a maturity wall. And in 1945, 1947, Britain hit the hardest maturity wall any major power had ever faced in modern history. The third problem made everything worse: the hidden cost of victory itself. To win the war, Britain had liquidated the majority of its overseas investments, the very assets that had generated invisible earnings for decades. It had sold off factories, mines, and shipping lines in South America, Asia, and the United States just to keep fighting. Those assets were gone forever. The income they once produced, income that used to help service debt, had vanished. So Britain entered the peace with massive debt coming due, dramatically higher refinancing costs, and a severely reduced ability to earn the dollars and gold needed to pay those debts. This was not bad luck. This was arithmetic. Let me make the numbers concrete. In 1939, Britain's net overseas investment income was still substantial. By 1945, it had fallen by more than 70%. At the same time, the annual interest burden on the new war debt was rising sharply. The cheap emergency credits of 1,940 were being replaced by loans carrying real commercial rates Britain could barely afford even in peacetime. The result was a vicious refinancing trap. Every time Britain rolled over maturing debt, it had to accept worse terms. Every time it accepted worse terms, the interest bill grew larger. Every time the interest bill grew larger, it consumed more of the limited foreign exchange Britain desperately needed to import food and raw materials for its starving population. This is the mechanism that quietly destroys empires. It is not dramatic, there are no explosions, there are only spreadsheets, but the spreadsheets are merciless. And here's the brutal perception most history books deliberately avoid. Britain did not lose its empire because it was militarily defeated. It lost its empire because it won the war on credit, and the creditor eventually named the price. The price was not just money. The price was sovereignty. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 forced Britain to make sterling fully convertible within a year, a condition Britain knew it could not meet, without triggering a balance of payments crisis. It also required the end of imperial preference trading systems that had protected British commerce for generations. In exchange for survival money, Britain was forced to open its markets to American goods and accept the dollar as the new center of the world financial system. This was financial surrender, dressed up as friendship. And the man who understood this better than anyone, Keynes himself, described the negotiations as the most monstrous injustice. Yet even he had no better option. Britain was trapped by its own wartime success. This mechanism, borrowing heavily during crisis, then facing a brutal maturity wall when the crisis ends, is not unique to 1945. It is a timeless pattern. The only thing that changes is the name of the empire and the name of the creditor. Now, at this point, any nation facing such a trap has only 4 realistic paths forward. None of them are painless, and that is exactly where Britain stood in 1946. This mechanism, borrowing heavily during existential crisis, then facing a brutal maturity wall when the crisis ends, is not unique to Britain in 1945. It is a timeless pattern. The only thing that changes is the name of the empire and the name of the creditor. To understand how deadly this trap really is, we must look at the 4 realistic options any heavily indebted power eventually faces. Britain in 1946 confronted all 4 at once. None were painless. And the choice it made quietly ended the British Empire. Option 1. Cut spending dramatically to close the gap. This would have meant immediate and savage austerity. Slash military presence across the globe, abandon bases from India to the Middle East, reduce reconstruction at home, and accept mass unemployment among returning soldiers. Politically, it was impossible. The British people had just sacrificed 6 years of their lives. They expected a better Britain, not a poorer one. No government could survive such cuts in 1946. Option 2. Raise taxes dramatically on an exhausted population. Britain was already one of the most heavily taxed societies on earth. Further increases risked social unrest, capital flight, and economic contraction at the exact moment the country needed growth. The middle class and working class, already bearing the scars of war, would have revolted. This path was technically possible, but politically suicidal. Option 3. Financial repression, the silent tax. This is the path history shows most governments eventually choose because it does not require an open vote. Allow moderate inflation to erode the real value of debt while keeping nominal interest rates artificially low. Savers, pensioners, and holders of fixed income assets quietly subsidize the state. Britain had already begun this during the war through forced savings and controlled prices. It would continue after 1945. The real burden of war debt was slowly shifted onto ordinary citizens through the gradual devaluation of their savings and purchasing power. Option 4. Monetization and dependence on the new creditor. This is what ultimately happened. Britain turned to the United States for the Anglo-American loan of 1,946. In exchange for survival money, it accepted conditions that dismantled the economic foundations of the empire, the end of imperial preference, rapid sterling convertibility, and the opening of British markets to American goods. Britain traded future sovereignty for immediate liquidity. These were not theoretical choices written in a textbook. They were the only doors available in that freezing negotiation room. And Britain, with no good options left, was forced to walk through the least bad one, option 4, combined with heavy financial repression. Here is the brutal perception that almost no popular history dares to state clearly. Britain did not lose its empire on the battlefield. It lost its empire at the negotiating table in Washington because the mathematics of debt eventually override military victory. The same pattern has repeated throughout history with terrifying consistency. In Weimar Germany after the First World War, the government chose options 3 and 4, printing money and relying on foreign loans. The result was hyperinflation that destroyed the middle class and paved the way for extremism. In post-Napoleonic France, in the declining Spanish Empire, in the late Ottoman period, every time a great power finances existential war through massive debt, the same 4 doors eventually appear. The structure does not change, only the costumes and the headlines change. And this is what makes the British case in 1945 so instructive for anyone who believes their own system is somehow different. The debt does not ask for permission. The maturity wall does not care about victory parades. The refinancing trap does not negotiate with national pride. Britain discovered too late that you can win the war and still lose the empire if the economic architecture is built on unsustainable credit. Now, what made Britain's situation even more dangerous was that this debt wall did not arrive in isolation. It collided with several other structural pressures at the exact same moment, turning a difficult problem into an existential one. Now, what made Britain's situation even more dangerous was that this debt wall did not arrive in isolation. It collided with several other structural pressures at the exact same moment, turning a difficult problem into an existential crisis. The first collision was demographic and industrial exhaustion. 6 years of total war had drained Britain's manpower and industrial capacity. Entire cities lay in ruins. The best and brightest young men had been lost on the battlefields. The factories that once supplied the world were worn out and obsolete compared to the untouched American industrial machine. Britain needed massive capital to rebuild, yet it had almost none left. The second collision was the rapid loss of invisible earnings. For over a century, Britain had lived off the income from its vast overseas investments, rubber plantations in Malaya, copper mines in Africa, shipping lines across the oceans. To finance the war, Britain had been forced to sell off the majority of these assets at fire sale prices. The golden goose that had quietly paid the empire's bills for generations was slaughtered in 1945. When the war ended, that steady stream of foreign income had largely disappeared. The third collision was the end of imperial preference. For decades, the empire had operated as a protected trading bloc. British goods enjoyed preferential access to colonies and dominions. The American loan demanded the rapid dismantling of this system. Britain was forced to open its markets to American competition at the precise moment its own industries were weakest. This was not trade, it was economic disarmament. The fourth and most devastating collision was the shift in global reserve currency status. For more than 100 years, the pound sterling had been the world's dominant currency. Central banks and traders held sterling as the ultimate safe asset. After 1945, that privilege began to erode visibly. Countries started shifting reserves toward the dollar. The pound's status, as the anchor of the financial world, the very thing that had allowed Britain to borrow so easily, was slipping away. All 4 pressures hit at once. And here's the cold perception that separates those who truly understand history from those who only read the victory chapters. Britain did not collapse because it fought poorly. It collapsed because it fought too well for too long on credit it could never sustainably repay. Now compare this to the United States in 1946, the nation everyone points to as proof that high debt is manageable. America emerged from the war with a debt to GDP ratio of approximately 119% high, but lower than Britain's. Yet America succeeded in reducing that burden dramatically over the next 25 years. Why? Because America had every structural tailwind imaginable. It possessed the only intact industrial base on the planet. It enjoyed a massive baby boom and expanding workforce. It held undisputed reserve currency status under the new Bretton Woods system. It faced almost no serious geopolitical competition. Its creditors were willing to accept moderate inflation and financial repression because they had no better alternative. Britain had almost none of these advantages. It faced headwinds instead of tailwinds. Its debt wall arrived when its empire was already overstretched, its industries exhausted, and its currency status declining. The same debt level that America could grow out of became a noose around Britain's neck. This is not a story about good policy versus bad policy. This is a story about arithmetic meeting reality. The post-war deleveraging playbook that worked for America in 1946 could not be rerun for Britain because the conditions that made it possible no longer existed for Britain. And this is the timeless lesson. Debt is not just a number. Debt is a claim on future production and future sovereignty. When the future you counted on no longer materializes, the claim becomes unbearable. Britain discovered this truth the hard way in 1945-1947. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet quietly began to dissolve, not with a bang, but with the stroke of a pen in a Washington negotiation room. The debt wall had won. And the most unsettling part is this. The same structural forces, massive wartime or crisis borrowing, followed by a maturity wall, colliding with declining relative power, are not confined to the pages of 1945. They are patterns. And patterns have a habit of repeating. The debt wall had won. But here is the brutal perception that almost no popular history dares to state clearly. Britain did not technically default on its debts. It did something far more damaging in the long run. It defaulted on its own people and on its own future. This is what I call the real default, the kind that never appears in credit rating reports, but shows up in grocery prices, lost purchasing power, dismantled empires, and generations that quietly became poorer than their parents. In Britain's case, the default took several silent forms. First, through sustained financial repression. Inflation was allowed to run higher than the interest rates paid on war bonds. Savers, pensioners, and anyone holding sterling-denominated assets watched their real wealth slowly erode. The government repaid its debts with money that bought less and less each year. Ordinary citizens subsidized the state without ever voting for it. Second, through the forced sale of empire assets. Britain sold off rubber plantations, shipping lines, mines, and overseas investments at distressed prices just to service the debt and import food. These were not temporary measures. They were permanent transfers of wealth and income streams that had sustained the empire for generations. Third, through the loss of policy sovereignty. The conditions attached to American loans forced Britain to abandon imperial preference trading systems and accept the dollar as the new center of the financial world. In exchange for short-term survival, Britain surrendered long-term economic independence. This was not a dramatic bankruptcy with headlines and court proceedings. This was a slow, grinding default dressed up as post-war reconstruction and special relationship. And the cost was paid by ordinary British families. Real wages stagnated. Rationing continued long after the war ended. The middle class that had carried the nation through the Blitz saw its savings and its future prospects quietly diminished. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet began to dissolve colony after colony, not because of military defeat, but because the bills finally came due. This pattern is consistent enough across centuries and continents to be called a structural law. When sovereign debt reaches unsustainable levels after a major war or crisis, the resolution almost always involves a transfer of real wealth. From the general public to the creditor class, from the old empire to the rising power, from yesterday's savers to tomorrow's debtors. In Weimar Germany after World War I, the industrialists who held hard assets and foreign currency emerged wealthier. The middle class, with its savings accounts and government bonds, was destroyed in months. In the Latin American debt crises of the 1980s, international banks were protected while ordinary citizens endured a lost decade of hyperinflation and collapsing living standards. In Britain, after 1945, the same mechanism operated more quietly but no less effectively. The state protected its ability to borrow again tomorrow, even if that meant adjusting its obligations to its own citizens today. This is not corruption. This is not conspiracy. This is the structural logic of any system that depends on continuous access to debt markets for its basic operation. The state cannot afford to alienate its creditors, because it must return to the market the day after tomorrow, so it protects the bondholder and quietly shifts the burden onto its own people. Britain, in 1945, 1947 offers the clearest modern autopsy of this process. A great power won the war, yet lost the peace not with bombs, but with compound interest and maturity walls. And the most unsettling realization is this. The same arithmetic that destroyed the British Empire is not confined to the past. Debt does not ask for permission. Maturity walls do not respect victory parades. And financial traps do not care about national myths. They simply compound. This is historical and educational analysis, not financial or investment advice. The purpose of this examination is not to predict the future, but to identify patterns, study mechanisms, and understand how systems actually behave under structural stress. Nothing presented here should be interpreted as a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold any financial instrument or asset. Your own circumstances require your own careful judgment. Let me return one last time to that freezing negotiation room in Washington in December 1945. Sir John Maynard Keynes, the man who helped design much of the post-war financial order, understood every number on that document. He understood the maturity wall, the refinancing trap, the narrowing menu of options, and the harsh reality that Britain had no good choices left. There was no secret plan. There was no elegant solution hidden in a classified file. There was only day-by-day management, painful negotiation, and the quiet hope that favorable conditions would somehow appear. Hope is not a strategy, but when pure mathematics leaves no comfortable options, hope is often what remains. The 1,945 debt wall was not a crisis that arrived with sirens and headlines. It was a slow-motion narrowing of every option the empire had. It made every future challenge harder, every investment more expensive, and every recovery more fragile. And the pattern is already in motion in our own time, only the names and the numbers have changed. If this kind of structural analysis matters to you, the kind that traces the hidden economic mechanics beneath the great victories and great defeats of history, the kind that reveals why empires fall not with bombs but with compound interest, then this channel exists for exactly that purpose. We study systems before they finish shaping us. If understanding these patterns before they become personal is valuable to you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. The next pattern is already forming, and most people will only recognize it when the spreadsheet already belongs to someone else. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.